Stage 4. Challenger Safety. Every society has its protectors of status quo and its fraternities of the indifferent who are notorious for sleeping through revolutions. Today, our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change. Martin Luther King Jr. The neuroplasticity of teams. Brain researchers used to think that the circuitry of the brain was fixed. They have since learned that the 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections among those neurons operate in an incredibly flexible way. The brain has plasticity and can rewire itself. A team is nothing less than a great brain. But the synapses take place between people rather than between neurons. Similarly, there is nothing fixed or hardwired about the speed or patterns of these connections. Teams are astonishingly plastic, so we really don't know the natural capacity of any team to perform. We simply know they can surprise us because the human ingenuity of a given group of people is unknown and unknowable. More than anything else, team plasticity reflects the leader's modeling behavior. If the leader suppresses dissent, people recoil as predictably as deer react to sudden movements. If the leader accommodates dissent, it builds the team's innovation surge capacity. Collectively, the team has sensory organs that react to the environment, adapting based on social, emotional, and intellectual processing of the conditions that surround it. Key question: what patterns has your team adopted from the leader? I once worked with a CEO whose team was struggling to adapt in a rapidly changing industry. He said his team was not smart enough, curious enough, or entrepreneurial enough. When his amygdala overpowered his prefrontal cortex, he acted out of frustration. The tenor of the team changed. His efforts to drive innovation would always result in a blowback of crippling silence. As fear extinguished curiosity, the team became sluggish, stubborn, and slow. Key concept: Challenger Safety democratizes innovation. After posting lackluster results for a couple of years, this feudal lord was fired. Fortunately, I had the pleasure of working with his successor. The anatomy of the executive team didn't change, but the environment did. The new leader introduced a new social technology, none other than Challenger Safety. He nurtured respect and permission to astonishing levels. He brought down the cultural barriers to entry. The team was a little skittish at first, but then came a wave of unprecedented productivity. You see, humans are designed to respond to kindness and empathy. They responded with improvement after improvement, innovation after innovation. The new CEO regenerated the neurological system of the team. The velocity of information increased. The co-creative process came alive. The adaptive capacity emerged. He took the team to intellectual heights they had never known. As a unit, they became more artistic and more athletic, more disciplined and more demanding, and ultimately, much more confident and aware of themselves. Key concept: when it comes to innovation, connectivity increases productivity. The changes in inputs brought changes in outputs. Here came the flow of insights, connections, associations, ideations, unexpected leaps, and aha moments. This is the promise of Challenger Safety. You can do the same thing this leader did if you encourage dialogue and emotionally tolerant dissent along the way. Because people are creative within a cultural context, it's the leader's job to liberate the creative impulse in that context. Now, here's the other side of it. Although the brain is plastic, it defaults to rigidity. Teams do too, which means that the past lingers in the present. The early socialization patterns and original norms tend to be incredibly stubborn and hard to replace. Key concept: to socialize a team with Challenger Safety from the beginning is always easier than to re-socialize a team later. Organizational change is a process that moves through three separate layers: technical, behavioral, and cultural. We often start by changing all three layers at the same time, but each one changes at a different pace. First is the structural or non human layer, or what we call artifacts. They include systems, processes, structures, roles, responsibilities, policies, procedures, and tools and technology. These things represent configurable parts and can be changed relatively quickly with money and authority. In the behavioral layer, we change the way people behave as they interact with the technical layer and each other in new ways. But simply because people are behaving differently doesn't mean that they want to or that they would continue in the new patterns if given the choice. When artifacts hold up behavior, they act as scaffolding, and once the scaffolding is removed, behavior reverts to past patterns, unless there are changes in the cultural layer. That tendency to snap back is what we call a regression to the mean. The third layer of change is the invisible layer, consisting of values, beliefs, and assumptions. Key question: can you think of a change you started but didn't finish, where you snapped back to your original behavior? In all social units, the cultural layer is the single most difficult thing to change and the layer that changes last. It's your lag indicator. You can impose change and get people to comply. If the chief medical officer at a hospital is watching, the doctors and nurses will wash their hands to decrease the risk of nosocomial infection. But if the chief steps away, their level of compliance immediately falls. Why? Because they lack intrinsic motivation. They go back to their calcified patterns. Team behavior is much the same. What compounds the problem in challenger safety is that you are asking people not only to change their behavior, but to do it in an environment of greater personal risk. The stage of brave. The culminating stage of psychological safety is the place where respect and permission intersect at the highest level, a super enriched zone dedicated to exploration and experimentation. To advance from contributor safety to challenger safety requires crossing the innovation threshold, a place where the highest possible level of psychological safety replaces what would normally be a place inhabited with the greatest fear. But creating challenger safety is far more difficult than understanding it. It's the ultimate cultural quest for every leader. Challenger safety is a level of psychological safety so high that people feel empowered to challenge the status quo, leaving their comfort zones to put a creative or disruptive idea on the table, which by definition is a threat to the way things are done and therefore a risk to themselves personally. To invite people to challenge the status quo is both natural and unnatural. It's natural in the sense that human beings are innately creative. The biologist Edward O. Wilson said creativity is the unique and defining trait of our species. The creative instinct propels us to challenge the status quo out of a desire to create and improve things. But doing so is unnatural in an environment that we perceive to be unsafe. If the environment is a pocket of thick trust, we will go forward with our challenge. If it's a pocket of thin trust, our self censoring instinct is triggered and we will remove ourselves from participation. The atmosphere either draws out or shuts down the creative impulse to challenge. It's scary enough to speak truth to power. It's even more scary to speak opinion to power because there's a bigger personal risk of rejection and embarrassment. I recently interviewed a vice president at a large healthcare system. He said the organization was more militaristic than the military. He challenged the status quo on a staffing issue early on and barely lived to tell about it. I thought I had a brain, but I guess I don't, he said. In this organization, you do exactly what you're told with no commentary. I interviewed another woman who worked at a large media company in South America. We are not allowed to be creative, she said. If you're not in senior leadership, you don't challenge anything. If you do, you're out. Clearly, not all leaders are convinced that psychological safety is necessary for innovation. As a result, some leaders believe that psychological safety is nothing more than asking people to be nice under the assumption that they need to be coddled before they can be expected to engage. Two Australian scholars, Ben Farr Wharton and Ace Simpson, make this point masterfully. Through a systems management perspective, the very human concept of compassion seems wasteful. This is because noticing, empathizing with, making sense of, and responding to a colleague's suffering, how we define the process of organizational compassion, may be considered an indulgent and time consuming process that detracts from immediate work duties. Those who say that psychological safety is nothing more than sympathetic and sentimental slush offered by leaders who are unwilling to hold others accountable are in denial themselves. They refuse to acknowledge that you can't coerce or manipulate innovation. The process is surrounded by political and interpersonal risk. Unless you lower or remove those barriers to entry and those violations in human interaction, people simply will not engage at full capacity. This final stage of psychological safety governs what are clearly the most sensitive, charged, pressurized, politicized, stressful, and high stakes situations of all. Because the fear and potential risk to the individual are highest, the level of psychological safety must be deepest. With inclusion safety, you're asking to be included. With learner safety, you're asking to be encouraged. With contributor safety, you're asking for autonomy. But with challenger safety, the social exchange has now gone to another level. The team is asking you to challenge the status quo. That's a mighty ask. Thus, the only reasonable condition is that the organization protect you in the process. If the organization wants candor, you need cover. You need real and sustained air cover to be brave enough to take what is almost always a substantial personal risk. In case it still hasn't sunk in, let me sketch the emotional landscape of innovation in an organization. It's one thing to use your talents in creative pursuits or be curious about something on your own. It's quite another to take aim at the status quo in an organization when the entire system and culture preserve it. If challenger safety doesn't exist in the organization, there's a high cost to that curiosity and creativity. It tends to be an arena of shame, pain, and embarrassment in addition to the normal uncertainty, ambiguity, and chaos. Innovation is hard enough because there's no safety from failure. No one can give you that. But what the leader can do is take the social sting and emotional bite out of the process. At a minimum, the absence of challenger safety blocks the flow of information that allows collaboration to happen. For organizations trying to create a thriving environment for neurodivergent talent, including employees who demonstrate variations in learning, attention, mood, and sociability, including the autism spectrum, dyslexia, attention deficit, hyperactivity, depression, and other atypical neurological conditions, challenger safety becomes a precondition for basic productivity. It's my personal experience that neurodivergent employees are more acutely sensitive to indicators of fear, react faster to them, and require more time to reemerge out of defensive routines. And yet, we all need challenger safety to help us be brave enough to challenge the status quo. Key question: when was the last time you were brave and challenged the status quo? When I teach leaders the concept of challenger safety and the social exchange of candor for cover, they often nod and say, I got it. That's when I stare back at them and say, no, you don't got that. You don't even begin to get the magnitude of what you are asking people to do. May I suggest at this point that you go find a mirror? Now, take a hard look. If you want your people to innovate, you need to do some soul searching and deep introspection about what you're asking. Innovation is not some kind of frictionless, comfortable process. No, Innovation is doing violence to the current regime. It's willfully knocking yourself out of orbit. It's trading certainty for ambiguity. Most of the time, it's asking for failure. That's just the organizational side of it. Now, think about the personal side. What are you asking of your people when you ask them to challenge the status quo and innovate? Yes, there's a sense of adventure that comes with exploration, but the reality is that you're asking your people to expose themselves to criticism, risk failure, take chances, be vulnerable, not fit in, and feel pain. And you're asking them to do all of this without any real control of the outcome. Now, do you see what you're asking? Well, if you're going to ask that, your employees are going to make a reasonable request of you. They know you can't promise zero loss. They know you can't remove all risk, and they know you can't eliminate the pain. Everybody gets that. So, at a minimum, they're asking you to protect them socially and emotionally as they engage in this free ranging process. At least protect me from embarrassment and rejection, comes the petition. Now, that's a reasonable request. And don't forget that not everyone craves creative contribution over comfort. Which brings us to the question of who goes first. I was training a group of employees at a university once and sat down at one of the tables to join a discussion. One of the participants said, "I get the candor for cover concept. Would you please tell the executives that the cover must come first?" Do they really expect me to give the candor when I haven't seen evidence of the cover? I may be dumb, but I'm not stupid. There you have it. Candor for cover means that you, as the leader, protect each person's right to speak candidly about any topic, provided they don't make personal attacks or have malicious intent. When people feel protected in that right, they tend to exercise that right. Key concept. The social exchange for challenger safety is cover for candor. The definition of respect in the fourth stage of psychological safety is respect for the individual's ability to innovate. Like the definitions of respect for learner safety and contributor safety, respect at this level is an earned right rather than an innate right. Thus, you earn the right to innovate based on a track record of performance. Am I saying you shouldn't have a voice until you become an expert? No, everyone should have a voice. But you will naturally find that people will take you seriously if that voice has credibility behind it. In addition to respect, the nature of permission changes as well as we transition to challenger safety. In the fourth stage, implicitly or explicitly, we are giving the individual permission to challenge the status quo in good faith. That means we assume the individual is acting with pure motive to help improve things. There are no other qualifications or restrictions. Sometimes people challenge the status quo with ideas for incremental improvement. Sometimes they take moonshots and propose a wholesale transformation to the way we do things. Sometimes they come with fully baked ideas and plans, and sometimes they come with nothing but an unsupported hunch or gut instinct. In an atmosphere of challenger safety, we take all comers and all contributions. We may take some challenges more seriously than others as we consider the source, but we honor each person's offering regardless of hierarchy. We make it safe to criticize. Everyone is expected to engage in disruptive thinking. Key question. Do you feel that you have a license to innovate in your organization? If you have challenged the status quo without challenger safety, you no doubt remember that painful experience, and you're very careful not to repeat it. Your brave attempt was met with retribution. You thought you had the air cover, but you were wrong, which left you naked to rejection. Those experiences are neurobiological encounters that create stress, scars, and vivid memories that cause us to err on the side of caution the next time. On one occasion, I was training a large law enforcement agency. I sensed right away that the culture was toxic and vindictive. Sure enough, as soon as we moved into the first discussion, you could plainly see that the members of this organization were not healthy enough to hold even a basic dialogue. By imposing the constant fear of criticism, the leaders had successfully created an atmosphere of jaded cynicism. The group dynamic was silence interspersed with sarcasm and occasional wisecrack and cutting humor. No one would dare challenge the status quo in good faith. That would be tantamount to a request for verbal and emotional abuse, which would come swiftly. If you're encouraging your people to challenge the status quo, but haven't prepared the climate by cultivating the necessary challenger safety, what can you reasonably expect? Are your people going to be brave and wander into enemy territory when they know their bravery will be met with punishment? Do people volunteer opinions when opinions are suppressed? Only fools rush in when it's not safe. If there's no air cover to back them up, it's unwise of them to try and disingenuous of you to ask. Even if you frame challenging the status quo as expressing healthy dissatisfaction, it's still subversive and always a personal risk. No cover, no candor. People will come up with defensive routines to save themselves from the risk of embarrassment. And if they make mistakes, they will be sorely tempted to cover them up. Key questions. When was the last time you tried to cover up a mistake? What motivated you to do that? Let me illustrate from my own professional experience. For 3 years, I had a Japanese boss based in Tokyo, Mr. Tadao Atsuki. When I was given the assignment to report to him, I braced myself because of what I had read about the rigid, hierarchical nature of Japanese business culture. I read a book about Japanese society that issued this warning. An expression of a contradictory opinion to that of the head was considered a sign of misbehavior. I'm in trouble, I thought, because I don't know how to do my job without giving my opinions, and sometimes they are bound to be contrary. But then came the pleasant surprise. Todd turned out to be a collaborative, trustworthy man who allowed me to be brave. He cultivated an idea meritocracy and was utterly agnostic about title, position, and authority, leveling the power dynamics and draining the anxiety out of the process of seeking help or feedback, and feeling vulnerable when you did. In the twilight of his career, this man had worked for several multinational corporations and had learned that diverse, multidisciplinary teams don't innovate unless they are lubricated with the oil of challenger safety. He understood that innovation requires exploring the unknown and always involves tension and stress. He asked me to be brave, but first created the organization's accommodation for that bravery, which of course would mean that I would often offer up bad ideas or go down dead end roads. But then there were times when the team would come up with breakthrough innovations. Key question. Do you strive to be agnostic about title, position, or authority when someone challenges the status quo? As a last step to set the table for challenger safety, he demonstrated transparency. He shared all the information he could, and he did it consistently. Key concept. The more unknowns the leader eliminates through transparency, the fewer sources of stress the employee worries about. I accepted the invitation. I ventured out slowly, observing my boss carefully for any signs of emotional defensiveness. Eventually, I quit fearing failure or judgment because it was, as Abraham Maslow put it, safe enough to dare. It was never a career ender to challenge something because I knew the culture tolerated and even expected it. It's the leader that creates that organizational laboratory of experimentation, and that lab requires conditions that are different from a pure execution mode of operations. Think about the inherent constraints under which we must innovate. Typically, we have less data, more ambiguity, more unknowns, and more failures. So we need more exploratory inquiry, more tolerance for unreasonable ideas, and more capacity to absorb failure. Clearly, innovation most often happens under conditions of stress, when you're feeling the pressure of competition, when you're trying to figure out a solution surrounded by constraints and limitations. There's nothing relaxed or carefree about it. Key concept. In the process of innovation, there is no necessary relationship between stress and fear. The stress and pressure we feel doesn't automatically create fear. I remember many times working for Tad when I felt enormous pressure and exhilaration. The pressure was imposed by our competitive circumstances, but he didn't add a layer of fear to the mix as a perverse incentive to get us motivated. By creating challenger safety, he helped convert stress into positive energy. I had been put in charge of an organization that was hemorrhaging cash. The market tanked and we were in a free fall. Instead of escalating interpersonal tension to accompany the crisis, my boss increased the frequency of his touch points with me, but they were always calm and focused encounters. Even when others showed up with spiked emotion, Tad was a de escalating influence. Eventually, we came through the crisis with a stronger, faster, and more engaged organization. Key concept. It's possible to unlock creativity in a crisis if the leader welcomes dissent and doesn't add a layer of manufactured fear to the existing level of natural stress. The social origins of innovation. Innovation means looking into the foggy future and trying to make something better by connecting things that are not normally connected using divergent, lateral, associative, or nonlinear thinking. You basically have three options. You can connect existing knowledge with new knowledge with new knowledge. Remember a few years ago when Netflix knocked Blockbuster out of the market? How did they do it? They connected snail mail with compact discs. Those two ordinary things became the source of an unlikely disruptive innovation. That's the pattern most of the time. We build on what we know using the tools, technology, and ideas we already have. How do you think chocolate and peanut butter came together? But here's the irony of innovation. Even though it's built on knowledge assets, it's the learning process that brings them together to create value in new ways. Key concept. In the process of innovation, learning is more important than knowing. Learning is the process of combining knowledge assets, but those assets are constantly becoming obsolete. In the long run, an enduring and adaptable learning process is more valuable than the perishable knowledge assets themselves. If we look at innovation further, we can see that there are two basic types. Type 1 is incremental and derivative, while type 2 is radical and disruptive. Key question. Can you think of a recent example of type 1 innovation, incremental and derivative, in your organization? As you might expect, type 1 is much more common because it's natural to start with what we know and connect it with something else that we know. If that doesn't work, we try new combinations of things. We combine and recombine. That recombination is the essence of innovation. That's why Steve Jobs said creativity is just connecting things. I'd like to add to that statement. Key concept. Innovation is the process of connected people connecting things. We all know that simply putting a bunch of virtuosos together doesn't automatically create beautiful music. They must learn to play together. They must connect first, and out of that connection comes the magic. The process of innovation. People can, of course, experience a light bulb moment of lone genius, a burst of inspiration, a eureka moment, but those are the exception. The more common pattern is for innovation to spring out of social interaction. In a Q&A session at Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg said, "Ideas typically do not just come to you. They happen because you've been talking about something and talking to a lot of people about it for a long period of time." Brian Wilson, the musical genius behind the Beach Boys, confessed the same truth. The key to our success was respecting one another's ideas and opinions. Yes, you need talented people to innovate, but the magic is in the way they blend and merge ideas as they work together in what often seems a chaotic and spontaneous process. It doesn't matter if you are writing software or writing music, innovation usually has a social origin. Are questions welcome? I invite you to be a cultural anthropologist for a day and watch the way innovation happens on your team. If you look carefully, you'll notice that innovation ultimately emerges from the process of inquiry. That process comprises 5 steps as shown in Figure 12. As you can see, the first step is to ask questions. Questions act as the catalyst. They activate the process. Without questions, nothing happens, and yet we must acknowledge the risk. Key concept. Asking questions introduces personal risk. And if we're talking about questions that point to innovation, they almost always introduce more personal risk because they challenge the status quo. They attack the way things are done. From a career standpoint, this is the high risk, high reward zone. Ask yourself, are questions really welcome on my team? Not soft, easy, non threatening questions, but courageous and disruptive questions. Key question. Are questions welcome on your team? Have you cultivated a culture of inquiry that is hospitable to tough, uncomfortable questions? And do people really feel that? If you want a surge of ideas, you first need a surge of questions. If you want a surge of questions, you need to nurture the highest level of psychological safety based on the respect and permission that you give people. We see very quickly that the entire process of innovation depends on a willingness to activate the inquiry process with questions. All organizations traffic in information and ideas, but not all organizations innovate. What makes the difference? If you haven't noticed, the natural consequence of analysis is friction. People see things differently and draw different conclusions. Now comes the hard part. How do you lubricate the gears of collaboration to reduce friction? If you can do it, you'll create new value. But if the friction increases, sand becomes the lubricant and your gears will grind to a halt. My Japanese boss was a master in nurturing a culture of inquiry. From the tone he set, I knew 2 things. First, there were no dumb questions. I think he had learned from experience, as many of us do, that the line between brilliance and ignorance can be very thin. Second, there were no questions that were off limits, no topics that we couldn't talk about. Those were the ground rules he established, reinforced by his own modeling behavior and a talk to listen ratio that hovered at 50-50. Without his example and the cover he provided, I would have been reluctant to activate the inquiry process and engage in innovation. In the end, inviting questions is the spigot that turns innovation on. Discouraging questions and punishing those who ask them turns the spigot off. Key concept. If you deprive your team of challenge or safety, you unknowingly dedicate the team to the status quo. Rather than protecting your team against groupthink, you're reinforcing it. You're conditioning your people not to think and not to challenge, and teams learn very quickly not to think and not to challenge. They learn very quickly how to lock themselves inside an echo chamber of like-minded friends. Whether your team innovates and how fast your team innovates is up to you. You regulate the speed of discovery and the velocity of information. You accelerate problem solving. You create a climate of discipline and agility. You engender the patterns and prevailing norms that allow the team to manage itself. I worked with another CEO who needed a lot of oxygen in any room and would always commandeer meetings. He couldn't get off the stage. At the request of a distraught vice president of human resources, I attended an executive meeting with this CEO and his team to observe the dynamic. In this case, the CEO wasn't outwardly insulting, just subtly demeaning. He began the meeting and drove the agenda. He would ask yes no questions and would become visibly agitated if his direct reports gave more than a few words of explanation beyond a simple yes or no. At one point, and I'll never forget this, the group started discussing a topic and getting into some productive dialogue. About 2 or 3 minutes in, the CEO literally opened his laptop and began doing email in the middle of the meeting. I looked at the vice president of human resources in disbelief, and she gave me a knowing look of resignation. This is the way he would censure and censor. Eventually, the CEO lost his job, dying of self inflicted wounds. He failed because his team functioned as vertical and independent blocks of knowledge that never came together. It's important to remember that innovation is interdisciplinary. Your success will depend not on independent action, but on your dependent interaction. If the team can't gel and productively work through the 5 steps of inquiry, you'll never get there. Regardless of the talent you have, you can only win as a team. It may seem unspectacular, but when you're watching innovation happen, you're watching people talk, interact, discuss, and debate. Only through that interplay and synthesis of ideas does constructive dissent, creative abrasion, and the process of combination and recombination happen. When I was the plant manager at Geneva Steel, I learned the lifelong lesson that every system has a constraint. The constraint not only limits, but also dictates the output of the entire system. The constraint is the bottleneck, and other parts of the system can't compensate for it. Consider the 4 by 400-meter relay event. Each of the 4 members of the team runs one lap around the track. If you're the slowest member, your slowness will dictate the overall performance of the team. Everyone depends on each other. If the 3 other members of the team run their stages in 48 seconds and it takes you 75, the team must still include your time in the total. Regardless of how fast they run, you're the drag. Innovation works the same way. Your job as a leader is to reduce social friction while increasing intellectual friction. This is the primary way to de-bottleneck the innovation constraint. If you can do this, people will invest deeply in the process because they become attached to what they create through the fusion of the rational and the emotional. I see team after team exquisitely blessed with every resource it needs to innovate except one: psychological safety, which is the constraint in the system. Key question: what can you do to reduce the social friction on your team while increasing the intellectual friction? It's one thing to collaborate for execution, which normally preserves the status quo. It's quite another to collaborate for innovation. Whereas execution is about creating value today, innovation is about creating value for tomorrow. It's an insurgent mission. A skunk works within the mothership. You're acting as disruptors in residence. That's what the Great Brain Project is all about. The process is not tidy, clean, or linear. It's messy and iterative. Innovation is the marriage of gnarly problems and creative chaos with only a possibility that you'll produce something better. Key concept: the pattern of innovation is to try a lot and triumph a little. Seek out differences and reduce the risk of ridicule. Let's dig a little deeper into the process of de-bottlenecking the organization to release its innovative potential. How do you get that innovation to flow? First, seek out differences. Second, reduce the risk of ridicule. Remember that innovation is the process of connected people connecting things. When we say connecting things, we mean things that are not normally connected. For example, James Dyson, the inventor of the Dyson vacuum cleaner, said he went to a lumber yard one day and noticed giant cyclones on top of the roof that were collecting dust. Immediately, he started connecting those cyclones to his idea of a bagless vacuum. If innovation comes from connecting different things, the leader's job is to stimulate differences in the first place. Those differences become the raw material that results in innovation. You're not looking for compliance or consensus. In fact, you're looking for the opposite. You want to create and bring out differences. You want people making new, strange, and non obvious connections. How do you do that? First, create differences in composition. That means assembling a diverse team. Diversity in composition can lead to diversity in thought. Because diversity creates dissent, diverse teams are less susceptible to groupthink. Now, bring out those differences by encouraging divergent thinking. Peter Drucker said, disagreement is needed to stimulate the imagination. Again, the natural consequence of analysis is friction because people see things differently and draw different conclusions. Key question: how do you protect your team against the dangers of group think? Do you see the delicate balance? You're trying to reduce social friction, but not intellectual friction. If you have too much social friction, sand becomes the lubricant and the gears of innovation grind to a halt. If you have too little, you develop homogeneous thinking and insulate yourself, losing your ability to adapt to a changing environment. You need to nurture differences and create a theater of conflict that carries natural pressure and stress, but not fear. My second suggestion is related to the first. When differences come out, do everything in your power as a leader to reduce the risk of ridicule. You do this by eliminating any ridiculing behavior in yourself and creating a norm that frowns on all forms of ridicule and installs peer based accountability to maintain that norm. When it comes to innovation, challenger safety is the enabler while fear and ridicule are the inhibitors. People are born curious, so the goal is to help them stay curious. Any form of ridicule is an intellectual muzzle that shuts innovation down. Key question: do you feel the risk of ridicule on your team? I remember being in a meeting with my team in which our chief financial officer openly ridiculed our chief marketing officer for some of his marketing ideas and the way he wanted to allocate his budget. Rather than intercede and call out the CFO right then and there, I let it go. I let it go in front of the entire team. I tolerated the ridicule, and my inaction that day sent a cowardly message that I spent the next month trying to undo. Because I didn't walk the talk, I opened the door for more ridicule and closed the door and more innovation. My failure of nerve compromised our challenger safety. A team of Israeli and European social psychologists recently verified the link between psychological safety and creativity. Simply knowing that your vulnerability will not be exploited encourages you to be brave and contribute to the generative process. As the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi argues, each of us is born with two contradictory sets of instructions: a conservative tendency made up of instincts for self preservation, self aggrandizement, and saving energy, and an expansive tendency made up of instincts for exploring, for enjoying novelty and risk. The curiosity that leads to creativity belongs to this set. Key concept: nothing can shut down curiosity and exploratory inquiry faster than a small dose of ridicule administered at just the right time. I've known leaders who thought it was acceptable to use ridicule for effect, perhaps reasoning that all the times they didn't use it would compensate for the few times they did. It doesn't work that way. If you scoff at an idea once for every 10 times you don't, it's the scoff we remember. Key concept: the challenge with challenger safety is that it takes time to create and no time to destroy. Are you prepared to be wrong? Remember the social exchange for challenger safety. Cover for candor. If your organization relies on innovation, you'll be serious about providing the needed air cover to others as they venture into the territory of challenging the status quo. You'll be more motivated to demonstrate a fundamental receptivity to both people and ideas, a cognitive and emotional openness that others clearly perceive. Not least, you'll develop the capacity to be wrong. That openness activates and facilitates the innovation process. Yes, you're a player, coach, and you can participate in challenging the status quo as yourself, but your primary role is to sponsor and protect rather than snare and disinfect ideas coming from every direction. Some leaders can't get out of their own way in this process. They net the good ideas and either cast them out or adopt them as their own. If you have an unappeasable need for status, if you crave credit and relish the trappings of power, if you need to be right, creating challenge or safety may well be your biggest leadership challenge. As Oscar Munoz, the CEO of United Airlines, said, it's the saddest thing when people haven't figured out the emotional intelligence side of things. You have to make yourself the kind of person that people are willing to come up to and provide advice. I once had a boss who wasn't very good at being wrong. He was a brazen leader with a deep sense of his own entitlement. He had a those who think they know everything are very offensive to those of us who do attitude. He was dogmatic, didactic, and pedantic. It was not only tiresome to be around him, but risky. His dripping ego shut Challenger safety down wherever he went. Not surprisingly, people adapted to his style quickly. One of the first adjustments his team made was to turn a real meeting into a charade. They venerated the boss with nervous respect in the official meeting, but then held the real meeting later in the form of sidebar discussions and kangaroo courts. Key concept. When a leader personally replaces the search for innovation with rivalry for prominence, the team can't achieve the social cohesion necessary for the co-creative process of innovation. My boss was practicing territoriality by controlling the airtime, the modern version of an antiquated model of dominance that eventually sealed his fate. He was fired. The great irony about this boss was that although he was highly intelligent, he acted this way because he felt vulnerable. He didn't want to expose himself to threat or embarrassment, but in the very act of trying to give himself challenge or safety, he was taking it away from us. This is exactly the pattern with a lot of smart people. You must be humble and open, and you must listen. And if you don't, the people around you will eventually have nothing to say. The world-famous cellist Yo-Yo Ma was once interviewed and asked, what's the key to fruitful collaboration, especially across cultures or disciplines? His response? Ego management. In small organizations and the lower levels of large organizations, I see the pattern of hubris less often, but as you climb to the C-suite, it appears more frequently. The leadership scholar Manfred Ketz de Vries asserts, the dysfunction most frequently found at senior levels is pathological narcissism. Narcissism is not something a person either has or hasn't. We all possess narcissistic characteristics to a degree. The speed of change outside an organization now favors the leader who explores, monitors the periphery, and extends the field of vision for the entire organization. Increasingly, we will not look upon our leaders as having the answers. We will look upon them as those who can draw out those answers by tapping the creative potential of the organization. If you have positional power, what should you do? First, know that doing all this will be difficult. Risk and fear are closely associated with formal authority. People will want to flatter you and not upset, disturb, or ruffle you. They will filter what they feed you. Make your organization culturally flat, even though it's not structurally flat. Make it egalitarian. Make status an artificial constraint. Here are 3 practical suggestions. First, have everyone on your team take turns conducting your regular meetings. Too many leaders monopolize that responsibility. Give everyone a turn. It will stretch them, but it will also build confidence. Second, conduct a short training segment each week and again rotate the responsibility to lead the training. Ensure that less experienced and lower status individuals have the opportunity to train more experienced, higher status individuals. This sends a clear message and accelerates development. Third, When you have a one on one conversation with a team member, go to them rather than have them come to you. Craig Smith will go to a student's desk and kneel next to them to help them with a calculus problem. It's a powerful gesture of servant leadership that reduces the status gap. Wherever the barriers to the free exercise of human ingenuity were removed, the Austrian economist Friedrich August von Hayek argues man became rapidly able to satisfy ever widening ranges of desire. Finally, be aware of the curse of success. Unfortunately, success may not be a friend when it comes to nurturing challenger safety. You've probably seen this pattern yourself. Success breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds a lack of humility, compassion, and a desire to accept feedback. You may have an impressive track record due to your grit and determination, but don't let your success become a limiting factor or derailer. Formally assign dissent at the beginning. The enemy of innovation is the homogenization of thought. How will you protect against it? Answer: you must assign dissent. It's not enough to model the correct behavior and informally reinforce the norms. You must formally and officially assign dissent. Some industries have mastered this practice out of necessity because they operate in environments of high risk. For example, NASA started deploying what they called Tiger Teams in the 1960s. A Tiger Team was a team of undomesticated and uninhibited technical specialists selected for their experience, energy, and imagination, and assigned to track down relentlessly every possible source of failure in a spacecraft subsystem. It was their job to look for potential problems, flaws, and risks. IT departments do the same thing when they commission so-called white hackers to look for vulnerabilities and potential sources of a data security breach. Key question: are you in the habit of formally assigning dissent to projects, initiatives, or proposed courses of action? Finally, I've worked with many technology companies in Silicon Valley who use what they call red teams for a similar purpose. You can call it loyal opposition, playing the devil's advocate, or doing a pre-mortem. How you brand it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're formally commissioning and officially dedicating resources to vet ideas and tell you why something might not work, where it's weak, why it's flawed. Doing this provides the needed cover for candor that helps the team push through the layers of status quo bias and loss aversion that normally guard the current state. It also culturally elevates the role of dissent and makes it socially and politically acceptable. Key concept: assigning dissent to a project, priority, or initiative from the beginning removes the natural fear normally associated with challenging the status quo. You are not only giving people a license to challenge, but also setting the expectation. In my experience, assigning dissent is the single most effective mechanism available to a leader to shift a culture toward agility. Nothing can reset cultural norms faster and more powerfully. Conclusion: the ultimate source of adaptive capacity, competitiveness, and self preservation, indeed the key to resilience and renewal, is the ongoing ability of an organization to learn and adapt. This capability is what allows us to engage in innovation and offer an adaptive or preemptive response. Though it may appear personally threatening, leaders must stand first in line to model the patterns of learning agility. This is not only a fundamental change from the expert model of leadership, but it also requires leaders to assume a very different emotional and social posture. Leaders will increasingly earn competence through their ability to learn and adapt rather than depending on their current knowledge and skills. Now, some final suggestions for creating challenger safety. Know that you are the curator of culture. You set the tone. At all costs, protect the team's right to speak up. Call anyone out that tries to silence others. Sometimes you will see something they can't. Sometimes they will see something you can't. If you jealously guard your own ideas, they will do the same thing. Display no pride of authorship. Give every member of your team the duty to disagree. Then brace yourself to hear the truth. Remember that a negative response to bad news or dissent will re-silence the team and seal your fate as a hapless leader. Don't make it emotionally expensive to challenge the status quo. Ask the members of your team to challenge specific things and discuss ideas on merit. A team often becomes lost and temporarily fails before it finds its way and eventually succeeds. This is a normal journey. The process is messy, iterative, and nonlinear, and there may be some pivots along the way. Point out that you're in uncharted territory and help your team enjoy the journey. If you reject a team member's suggestions, show sensitivity by explaining why. Your considerate response will embolden the individual to keep and use their voice. Conclusion: avoiding paternalism and exploitation. Just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. Toni Morrison. Psychological safety requires both respect and the permission to participate. One without the other creates a dangerous imbalance that hurts people in different ways. A serious deficiency in permission pushes a team into the gutter of paternalism, whereas a serious deficiency in respect moves it into the gutter of exploitation. In either case, the organization will lack the motivation, confidence, and unit cohesion to perform at its best. Key concept: the gutters of paternalism and exploitation flood the organization with fear. Paternalism's lack of permission creates the fear of social isolation. When you're constantly told what to do, you get used to it, gradually becoming passive and unsure of yourself to the point that being self-reliant becomes a frightening prospect. You seek comfort more than freedom, security more than independence. How can the social pressure to conform be stronger than the desire to express your opinions and make your own decisions? Paternalism and exploitation hold the answer. Either you've been taught to be servile and compliant, or you've been forced to be. I've spent some time in Poland a few years after Eastern Europe had been liberated. As I met with men and women and toured several manufacturing plants, the lingering Soviet influence and long night of despotism revealed itself in stubborn patterns of paternalism and exploitation that wouldn't seem to go away. Some people yielded to communist paternalism and were content to face a hopeless future. Others remained unbowed, shook off the chains of oppression, and were busy starting businesses and making things better. In a similar way, exploitation's lack of respect creates the fear of harm in addition to the fear of isolation. Once, when I was in Shanghai on business, the gentleman I was meeting with told me that he would hold confidential meetings on the street rather than in his office because he feared his office was bugged and he was being monitored under the watchful eye of government. In both cases, paternalism and exploitation lack the balanced quantities of respect and permission that create psychological safety, leading individuals and organizations to perform below their potential. I interviewed a woman who had lived and worked under a repressive and autocratic regime in South America. "We were never allowed to be creative," she said. The patterns of paternalism and exploitation are universal, inhabiting every society and penetrating every culture. Let's take a closer look at each of these two patterns. The gutter of paternalism. Paternalism is telling you what to do, supposedly in your own best interest. A higher authority will supply your needs or regulate your behavior because it doesn't believe you can do it yourself. Laws are the most common form of paternalism. You must be 18 to vote. You must wear a seatbelt. You must not swim in a riptide. These are sensible measures, but Let me give you some less enlightened examples of actual laws on the books. You can't pump your own gas, can't harass Bigfoot, can't eat fried chicken except with your bare hands, can't walk backward after sunset. We're often told that we need a benevolent parent, teacher, coach, or boss to protect us, manage our freedom, and direct our actions so we don't hurt ourselves or others, especially with fried chicken. There are certainly times when this sort of benign despotism is warranted. Remember my son who was practicing his driving to get his driver's license? He got it, and when we went to the Division of Motor Vehicles to pick it up, the woman who issued his license made it very clear to him that his parents had the right to revoke his license at any time. The power of paternalism is often good and necessary. It protects us until we are wise enough to protect ourselves. Key questions. Do you show signs of unnecessary paternalism toward any group or individual? Why do you do this? Misguided paternalism means we're granting some respect to the individual, but withholding the power to choose. There's a time and place for appropriate paternalism, but when it continues after the individual has demonstrated the ability to learn, contribute, or innovate without a lot of direction and guidance, it's time to back off. Not only that, it's time to listen, encourage, and empower the individual. When you're controlled by extrinsic motivation, you look outside yourself for punishments or rewards. You're stripped of autonomy and, in the process, an internal impetus to action. Key principle. Unnecessary paternalism runs the risk of breeding dependency and learned helplessness on the one hand, and frustration and rebellion on the other. Higher education, healthcare, and government are sectors marked by professionalism, competence, and a deep sense of collegiality. But these sectors are also more risk averse than the private sector and typically have no established norm or process for pitching or testing new ideas. They tend to hang a do not disturb sign, coalesce into a make nice culture, and lead from the gutter of paternalism. I've worked with many universities, healthcare organizations, and government agencies, and consistently encounter this pattern. Healthcare organizations are animated by a mission to extend life and do no harm. And yet, most hospitals are dominated by broken authoritarian cultures no different from the one in my steel mill. Similarly, institutions of higher learning are dedicated to the mission of education and research and are inclined to be driven by consensus. The deeply ingrained sense of respect these institutions have for humanity is beyond reproach. Where they struggle, however, is in the way they grant permission to their members to learn, participate, and most of all, innovate. Each sector is deeply entrenched in a tradition of glacial incremental change and paternalistic leadership. If you don't think paternalism is a liability in tumultuous times, consider that 84 nonprofit institutions of higher learning in the United States have closed their doors or been consolidated since 2016. Rather than discourage people from challenging the status quo out of fear, these sectors tend to do it through neglect. They listen to ideas, tolerate debate, express appreciation for proposed disruptive courses of action, take it all under advisement, and smile. And then not much happens. As a result, people don't self-censor out of fear. They simply leave out of frustration. I helped with an organizational transformation with a leading research hospital that lasted a year. On both the clinical and administrative sides of the house, we spent months putting together transition plans that would take the organization from its current state to a better one. We had long-term strategic plans, shorter-term tactical plans, and even shorter-term operational plans that included assignments, due dates, and other details. After all this preparation, the executive team came back and said, "We just don't think the organization is quite ready for the transition. We're going to think about doing it next year." What this hospital had learned is the lesson that most paternalistic leaders eventually learn. Paternalism is safe in the short term, but grows dangerous in the long term. In your benevolence, you cut off the circulation of local knowledge that is flowing to you from the bottom of the organization. Suffer the consequences of isolation and find yourself in crisis later. Healthcare, higher education, and government are good examples of paternalism, but it exists in every industry and sector. In most paternalistic societies, there's strong deference to authority and a desire to honor the past. People try to say yes to every request because they don't want to appear disloyal. Saying no is an unpopular answer, and no one wants to face social disapproval. Over time, paternalism leads to a low tolerance for candor and a lack of bravery. If the pattern becomes widely and deeply institutionalized, it compounds risk and often explodes in crisis. Except for natural disasters, nearly every human crisis announces itself in advance. In paternalistic organizations, the warnings often go unheeded. Scandals and business failures don't come out of nowhere. Why would an organization repeatedly choose not to respond to early warning signs? Agile, alert organizations respond. Lumbering, paternalistic ones don't. The gutter of exploitation. Exploitation combines high permission with low respect. It tends to be motivated by the universal temptation towards despotism, the urge to control others for gain and gratification. Key concept: whether personal or organizational, exploitation requires some type of repressive apparatus by which to extract value from humans, either by manipulation or coercion. Exploitation comes in degrees, but it is always based on the exploiter's allegiance to selfish ambition. James Madison reminded us in the Federalist Paper 10 that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. Think of Jack Ma, the founder of China's internet giant Alibaba, and his promotion of what he calls the 996 work schedule. You work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week with no overtime pay. Isn't it interesting that he frames it as a philosophy to give it more legitimacy? Similarly, my nephew recently finished a stint at a major investment bank and was required to work from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day. Is there any concern for the needs of human beings in this case? No, it's the pure extraction of utility. The asymmetry in the way value is created and captured is the dead giveaway. When acquisition becomes an addiction, corporate chieftains tune their organizations based on a pure shareholder return theory of the corporation. That's the beginning and the end of their stewardship, which often leads to predatory tendencies toward employees. What concerns me is that people can become conditioned to accept exploitation, which leads to the normalization of abuse. Reflect on these words from the great Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Peasants are a silent people, without a literary voice, nor do they write complaints or memoirs. He may have been talking about another time and place, but the pattern is the same. When exploitation is permitted, people learn to accept it without complaint. Even those who are exploited can become defenders of the very exploitation they suffer. What makes it confusing, and therefore sustains it, is when leaders alternate acts of kindness and generosity with acts of violence and abuse. Key concept: exploitation is the process of extracting value from another human being while disregarding that person's inherent value. In civil society, most forms of coercive exploitation are illegal and therefore less visible. Ironically, we have officially purged civil society of slavery, and yet human trafficking is at an all-time high, with an estimated 40 million persons working in forced labor and servitude. But the most common forms of exploitation are not illegal, just immoral. They take the form of rudeness, unkindness, incivility, and abuse, and they exact a terrifying toll. Christine Porath and Christine Pearson, for example, show in their research that 98% of workers have experienced uncivil behavior at work. Half report being treated rudely at work at least once a week. Key questions. Do you show signs of exploitation toward any group or individual? Why do you do this? Beware the land of false fellowship. I said in the preface that human beings long to belong, but that longing can be taken too far. When others prey on your need to belong, there comes a point when you must say adios, when it's far better to live without approval because that approval is feigned and destructive. As the philosopher Terry Warner has rightly observed, approval is held out as relief from this insecurity. At some point, we simply need to stop caring about what others think. If not, we become vulnerable to further exploitation, giving others the power to control or manipulate us and turning us into victims. Social approval, belonging, and connectedness are needs. But no one really needs constant validation. If your most consuming fear is to be alone, you're easy prey to a shaming culture, and you would do well to pry yourself away from the social mirror. In the digital world, to be happy in your own company is a survival skill. When necessary, healthy rejection of popular opinion is a beautiful thing. Key concept. We crave attention, sometimes even if it's the wrong kind. Attention alone never satisfies, but it can deeply hurt. My son came home from middle school one day and was talking about how many followers his friends had on Instagram. He then proceeded to tell me that several of them used their parents' credit cards to purchase followers. If that were not alarming enough, he said some of the parents encourage it. The like button has become an altar of worship. If you want to be happy, you will sometimes need to politely disconnect to protect yourself. Anyone who thinks that their inherent worth will diminish if they don't have constant validation from others doesn't understand the meaning of inherent. Many people stand ready to shame you if you don't join their ranks, do what they do, think what they think, or wear what they wear. If your happiness depends on popular opinion, prepare to be unhappy. A shaming culture demands compliance and hurls contempt on those who dare leave its company. In such a place, relationships are based on the reciprocation of flattery and false praise. In this self-imposed reality distortion field, we breathe fiction to our neighbors and they to us. We feed on appearance and image and drink the strong wine of self-deceit. If you live or work in such a congress of cowards, please remember that humans have always created social units where anyone is welcome, admission is free, but the truth is forbidden. You can be anyone you want to be except your true and authentic self. In the land of false fellowship, members gain their sense of identity from the common sense of superiority they feel for themselves and the common sense of disdain they feel for others. Relationships are superficial and loyalty conditional. People enter those relationships to deflect the truth about themselves. Key concept. In the land of false fellowship, unnatural competition replaces natural affection. But what if you're already in the land of false fellowship? What if you're in a relationship you need to escape, enduring abusive treatment, tolerating destructive behavior? What do you do? First, understand that the other party will often try to convince you that you need them or that you must accept their treatment. Prepare for skillful manipulation. The control response is as predictable as the sunrise. As the Eagles song goes, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. The truth is, you can leave. If you're being exploited, abused, or harassed, you're being denied the respect and permission you're entitled to as a human being. If that's not going to change, give yourself inclusion safety. Sometimes that means standing alone, absorbing an economic loss, being misunderstood, or taking a hit to your reputation. In my own professional life, I've witnessed psychological terrorism at its worst and watched it demolish self worth and drown initiative and creativity. I've worked with business associates who have been driven by greed and unbridled ambition and think it no crime to leave a wake of economic and emotional destruction behind them. There have been times when I was too trusting and didn't acknowledge the warning signs of ulterior motive and ill intent. We've all been scraped by an insecure leader, a cruel pretender, a small time exploiter on the take. Sooner or later, we find ourselves swimming in a red zone on the receiving end of hurt and humiliation. As fellow travelers, we scrape each other. As I said in the preface, we're all wounded and guilty. But when the hurt comes deliberately and continually, that's abuse. It's time to create boundaries and change the terms of engagement. I can't possibly address the vast ocean of human suffering, and I fully understand the threat of real danger. In my volunteer work, I've helped abuse victims in tragic circumstances and seen the wreckage that surrounds them. In the end, we can and must help ourselves. Nobody is a nobody. Whether or not you're accepted, you're acceptable. If you're human, you're enough, but you must act to protect yourself. Here are some suggestions. Love yourself first. Give yourself inclusion safety, the respect and permission you inherently deserve. If others won't give you psychological safety, you must at least give it to yourself as you work to change your circumstances. Be alert to the motives of those around you. If you observe others acting maliciously toward you, even if it's mild, act early to confront the behavior or remove yourself from the situation. Don't believe that you must accept abusive treatment. That's a lie. Do everything in your power to protect yourself. Learn resilience in your resistance. As you work to liberate yourself from unhealthy treatment, fight back in healthy ways. Because of the hurt, anger, guilt, self-hatred, and anguish people suffer as a result of social and emotional persecution, they often resort to equally unhealthy response patterns. That just makes things worse. Avoid drugs and all forms of self-harm and self-indulgence. Don't heap more hurt on yourself. If you feel dominated, controlled, or trapped with no apparent means of escape, search for a way out or leave immediately. In the meantime, refuse to entertain damaging thoughts about yourself. You can eventually heal and overcome everything. Find and connect with trustworthy, happy people who genuinely want your success and are willing to help. Consult with them as you make decisions and consider options. Key question. Have you ever felt trapped in the land of false fellowship? How long did you stay? How did you get out? 60 billion interactions every day. The world's population is fast approaching 8 billion. Every day, those nearly 8 billion people have an estimated 60 billion interactions with each other. In each interaction, we extend a measure of respect and permission, which determines a certain level of psychological safety. Each one of those interactions either nourishes or neglects human potential. The more we create psychological safety, the more we enjoy the rewards of rich connection, belonging, and collaboration. The less we create it, the more we suffer the bitterness and sting of isolation. We seem to be stuck in an existential fog in which the complex social matrix in which we live our lives is our biggest challenge. We alone are responsible for the antagonisms we create among ourselves. And yet we continue to shed emotional blood, not just occasionally, but constantly. Are we medieval? Have we not ripened in wisdom? Psychological safety is built on a moral foundation of looking on our fellow creatures with respect and giving them permission to belong and contribute. That isn't to say that we condone flagrant or harmful ethical misconduct or that we don't judge the skill and performance of each other. We must do that. We're all accountable. But when it comes to worth, people are owed respect because they're people. The moment we begin to devalue, objectify, or dehumanize each other, we forsake humanity. Don't tell me you have a company to run or results to deliver. Don't tell me you're important. Don't tell me this is high stakes or you're under pressure or you have your triggers or you're prone to grown up meltdowns. If you make any excuse for not extending psychological safety, you're choosing to value something else more than human beings. Consider, for example, the 35 employees at France Telecom who recently took their own lives as a result of relentless and systematic harassment. Rather than creating a supportive, humanistic workplace, the leaders dehumanized their lower ranking colleagues with institutionalized oppression, leading to tragic consequences. We can give ourselves warm baths of self satisfaction and blame our poor behavior on personality, work style, pressure, stress, anxiety, deadlines, or a disadvantaged past. Welcome to the human race. We don't get a pass for those things. Remember, we can't claim special status, but isn't that what we're doing when we refuse to extend psychological safety to another person? So is hiding behind the guise of tolerance or political correctness only to excoriate those who don't share our values or agenda. Harvard's 75-year study of human happiness, which is now in its fourth generation, has identified what we already know intuitively. As the Grant Studies director, Robert Waldinger, summarizes, the clearest message that we get from this 75-year study is this: good relationships keep us happier and healthier. It's connection that in the end brings us sustained happiness. With its restorative and healing powers, cultivating relationships is the one non-pharmaceutical therapy, the one redemptive act that continues to bring us the most joy. A swelling demand for leaders who create psychological safety. When I say the words human potential, what comes to mind? Think about the potential of those around you, your family, friends, neighbors, classmates, coworkers. Ironically, whether you care about their potential or not, you have an impact on it, and others have a profound impact on yours. The people you spend the most time with are the ones you influence the most. But even those you rarely see, even those with whom you may have had only a chance encounter, may be profoundly affected by your influence. Even a few words can change a life. Through our interactions, we cultivate or crush potential, which always brings us back to the concept of psychological safety. In the days ahead, you will see a swelling demand for leaders who create a high level of psychological safety on their teams and in their organizations. This demand is the natural consequence of competing in a highly dynamic environment that relies on constant innovation. It's also the natural consequence of highly intelligent people who've had one too many bosses dripping with ego and control issues. Key concept. At an individual level, we need personal fulfillment and happiness. At an organizational level, we need innovation and a sustained competitive advantage. In fact, we're starting to see the beginning of a sea change in how many of the best organizations in the world choose their leaders. It's counterintuitive to the conventional thinking that a leader must be a charismatic, hard-driving repository of vision and answers. In fact, the traditional archetype of a leader, forged on the imperial concept of leadership, abundant with hubris and advocacy skills, is fast becoming an occupational hazard. The primary characteristic of this new variety is an individual who possesses superb emotional intelligence with a highly controlled ego. Key question. Do you practice the imperial concept of leadership, or have you evolved to a higher stage of development based on emotional intelligence and controlled ego? A growing body of research confirms that emotional intelligence creates psychological safety in the organization, which, as a mediating variable, accelerates innovation. In hyper-competitive markets, innovation is the lifeblood of survival and the mainspring of growth. Thus, The leader of the 21st century must be able to thrive in this context as an example of collaboration, creative abrasion, and humility. The industrial concepts of command and control on the one hand and benevolent paternalism on the other are dying an ignominious death because they activate the self censoring instinct and shut down the ability to innovate. If we don't cultivate a higher tolerance for candor, we can't convince people to release their discretionary efforts. They're already hypervigilant to any threat. So, the single most important question in the selection of a leader is fast becoming this: does the individual create or destroy psychological safety and therefore stimulate or stifle innovation? In a letter to employees, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, expressed the spirit of psychological safety and the path to inclusion and innovation. Together, we must embrace our shared humanity and aspire to create a society that is filled with respect, empathy, and opportunity for all. Pluralism is our reality. In our hierarchy of loyalties, let's think above personal and tribal differences and enshrine our central tie, the allegiance and affinity that matters most, the bond of belonging to the human family. Let me return to the call to action I issued at the beginning of the book. I invited you to conduct a searching personal inventory about the way you behave toward others, especially those who are strangers or against whom you have a lingering bias or prejudice. 1. Inclusion safety. Are you prepared to cross the threshold of inclusion, bridge differences, and invite others into your society? 2. Learner safety. Are you prepared to encourage others to learn? 3. Contributor safety. Are you prepared to give others the autonomy to contribute and deliver results? 4. Challenger safety. And finally, are you prepared to cross the threshold of innovation and provide air cover for others to challenge the status quo and innovate? To conclude, let me share an ancient case study in psychological safety. Regardless of your religious persuasion, the story is awesomely powerful. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts, Peter, a Jew, is taken to Cornelius, a Roman centurion. Peter had grown up with the understanding that non-Jews were common